I'm puzzled, I have to say, by your interpretation of your role. I'm very surprised by what I've heard today. If I understand what I've heard correctly, you are both essentially saying that you are governed by the same set of laws as the non-public interest directors.
Exactly.
Now, Minister Noonan, in response to a PQ, stated the following: to address the scope for actual and perceived conflicts between the fiduciary responsibilities of the directors of the financial institutions under company law and the wider public interest, and he goes on, I'm skipping a line or two, but the meaning holds, the overriding duty of directors, he's talking about the public interest directors, the overriding duty of directors of the covered institutions relates to the public interest as set out in the Act.
And he's referring to all non-executive directors on the boards of the covered institutions.
In the 210 Act, because there's a difference between the 28 and 210 Act. Sorry,
so,
Deputy.
Thank you. I have the 210 Act here. And the appointment of public interest directors is specifically what's being talked about in Section 4, one of which is to align the activities of the relevant institutions and the duties and responsibilities of their officers with the public interest. And as you both know, Section 48 goes on to say the duty imposed by subsection 1, which I've just talked about, which is with the public interest. So the duty imposed, quote, takes priority over any other duty of the directors.
Company law.
Over any other duty of the directors.
You read out a previous one in relation to company law.
That, to me, is pretty clear. If there was no difference between public interest directors and non-public interest directors, there'd be no need for this. There is specific legislation dealing with your role. It is a unique role. It is a role in response to the crisis. So I find it extraordinary that you would say that there is no legal difference between your role and the role of directors. There is. There's legislation specifically addressing the differences between your role and critically giving you the authority to override your other responsibilities in the public interest. That's what it says.
Appointed under the 208 Act, not the 210 Act. The 210 Act brought in legislation, as you read out, I think mostly there, that the overriding interest is the public interest for all directors.
Okay.
The board.
Do you consider yourself governed by the 210 Act?
Yes.
Okay. In which case, is it reasonable for me to say that your overriding duty is to the public interest?
Yes.
Overriding duty. Yes. Therefore, you are not equally constrained by your duty to the institution.
I have to still go by company law. The company law that appointed us. All non-executive directors are in that position, whether they come in nominated from whatever source, including public interest directors under the 208 Act. Okay. That's my interpretation of it.
Okay.
Deputy, could I,
yes, please,
if I might, if I could just refer to the Minister's own interpretation of Section 48, which I pursued a few months ago. He states to the House some time ago that to assist in addressing the scope for actual and perceived conflicts between the fiduciary duties of all directors of financial institutions under company law and the wider public interest in circumstances where institutions are in receipt of huge financial support from the state, and that's a quote from the Minister. Section 48 of the 210 Act now provides legal clarity, not just to the role of the public interest director, but to that of the entire boards of such institutions. It provides unequivocally that the overriding duty of all directors of the covered institutions, irrespective of the circumstances of appointment, relates to the public interest as set out in that Act. So, in truth, all directors, if you want to use the phrase, all directors are public interest.
And we are agreed, therefore, that by law you are covered by legislation which says your overriding duty is the public interest.
Yes.
Okay. That is therefore very, very different to saying we are simply bound by company law. You're not. You have legislation that says you can override any of those responsibilities in the public interest. That's not what has been said here to date. It's a very, very important distinction.
Let me clarify that, because I think I'll go back to quote from the reply given by Minister Lennon on the 16th December 2010, because I think Margaret only read out the second half. To read it all, so that we'll have it on the record, Deputy Donnelly, if you don't mind. Public interest directors, though nominated by me, have been appointed by the boards of the various covered institutions. Details of individual public interest directors, including remuneration, are published in the annual reports. And this is the important thing. The general rule is that directors, including non-executive directors, owe their duties to the company, and thereby company law is where we operate. The interests of the company are paramount. Public interest directors bring, in addition to other experiences and so on, as Margaret had dealt with earlier.
Thank you, Mr. MacSharry. I'm just going to stick with this, Chair, if I can, because this really is very important. I have exactly what you've just read out, Mr. MacSharry. It goes on to say to address the scope for actual and perceived conflict. So let's think very carefully about what the Minister has said. The Minister has said your responsibility is to the institution. However, for public interest directors, there is the potential for actual conflict. In the case of actual conflict, your overriding duty is the public interest. This is very clear. That is not what has been represented at this committee. You are not bound solely and exclusively by company law. You can override company law, as laid out in the legislation, as in the narrative of the Minister's answer, in the public interest. I think it's very, very important that we understand the scope that you actually have.
That is in relation, Deputy, if I just come in relation to actual conflict. So the actual conflict has to exist before what you're saying comes in, and I agree with you completely, Deputy.
Great. Okay. Well, this is very important, because it's a very nice segue into the next thing I want to talk about. I'd like to continue on what Deputy Doherty brought up. Right now, you'll see on the screens, the Personal Insolvency Bill is making its way through final stage. We're going to vote on it this evening. And very regrettably, I'm going to be voting against it. I've supported Minister Shatter the whole way. And I'll tell you one of the things that made me decide to vote against it, and I made this decision today, is that Richie Boucher came out yesterday and said, within the context of the personal insolvency legislation, and the Chair alluded to this earlier on, there will be no debt forgiveness. Now, Mr. MacSharry, you have said, and I just took down a few things you've said, there will be no debt forgiveness, none. We're not going to do that. There will be no debt forgiveness. We will not be writing off any debt. Now, my understanding of that, and I appreciate there are semantics between writing off and debt forgiveness. I personally, and I know there was no insult intended, I find the phrase debt forgiveness, and I'm not suggesting you were trying to insult anyone, I find that insulting. So I would like to use the phrase debt surrender. So I just want to be very clear on this. Let's take an example. I find it's usually the best way to clarify these. Let's take a permanent TSB borrower who borrowed €400,000, and the property is now worth €200,000, and the change in her circumstances mean that she could now service a mortgage of €250,000, capital and interest. The specific intent of the legislation that is making its way through the Chamber right now, and which I'm about to go and talk to, is that permanent TSB would write down, would surrender €150,000 worth of debt. In other words, it would say, for let's say a 3-year period, we will leave you with enough for a reasonable standard of living. We will take the rest. And at the end of the 3-year period, your mortgage is not €400,000, it is €250,000. That's the intention of the legislation. Now, that sounds to me, and that, by the way, is in the public interest. Unless I am misinterpreting what you were saying, Mr. MacSharry, what I've heard you say, the bank's position, and use worrying phrases like "we" in the bank, have a very different interpretation of how that example would work through. Could you maybe explain to the committee how you would see permanent TSB engaging with that example?
Yes, Deputy. Chairman, I was following on in relation to the same kind of questions that were asked of the Chief Executive when he was here, when both sides, the committee and the Chief Executive, used debt forgiveness. There can be many other ways of describing that.
Yeah.
So that's what I was following on from. And as a non-executive director of the board and not an executive, I'm not fully sure of what policies might or might not be developed by an executive that may or may not come to the board for approval at some stage. These things happen all the time with executive teams. But we're talking about as of now. I know there's legislation going through the Oireachtas at the moment, and I know it's to help those unfortunates who are in great difficulty with their mortgages, whether it's negative equity or whatever. The fact of the matter is this, that insofar as permanent TSB is concerned, it will deal with that legislation. It will be the law, and it will deal with it accordingly. Insofar as individual cases are concerned, Deputy, as of now, without that legislation, our team are dealing with customers in arrears and in difficulties on an hourly basis every day. And we will continue.
I'm sorry to cut across you. I have very little time left. This is very, very important. As a public interest director, and Ms Hayes, you might answer as well, to the example I have given you, 400 borrowed, she can service 250, her personal insolvency professional recommends 250 and recommends the permanent TSB bring down for the borrower, surrenders €150,000, all legal hold on that. Is that your understanding, and is that what you will be representing that permanent TSB should do as our public interest directors in this case?
At all times I will represent the law, whatever the law is and the interpretation of that law.
Could you answer the specific question if you would?
I don't know, because it's hypothetical. I don't know exactly what the situation will be.
It's not hypothetical
and it will
at
be
all.
a matter for management to take the new legislation into account and come forward with proposals in that context for the cases that you've just, the type of case you've just outlined.
Can I finish on this then, Chair? I am going to interpret your answer as no. Because what you said is the bank is not going to engage in this sort of thing. There's a phrase I spent...
As of now, that's the position.
Right.
I said when the law, I did say as well, you may not have written it down, Chairman, but I did say as well, in the context of the new legislation, we will be looking at that and see how we have to apply it. That will be our duty.
And it doesn't sound to me like you're doing that with the hat of public interest on. Look, in consulting, which I spent several years in, there's a phrase, I'll finish, this is my last comment, there's a phrase, whenever we used to send a team into a client, we were always afraid that they would go native. And that means that they would forget what their job was, and they would become part of the client that they had gone in to see. And I say this with the greatest respect for both of your long careers of public service. In my opinion, based on what I've heard, really in response to Deputy Doherty's questioning, it feels to me like you have both gone native. And again, I say that with the greatest respect for your many, many years of public service. But the language that I'm hearing, particularly from you, Mr MacSharry, and particularly with regard to the personal insolvency bill, is not in the public interest. It is in the interests of the banks. And I say that regrettably and with respect. But that is my...
Well, you can have your interpretation as you like, and I have mine. There is nobody around as much as I that would love to see the kind of questions you're asked being answered in the positive. But somebody somewhere, the taxpayer probably, is going to have to put up money if that has to be done, in addition to what already has been put in. I would love to be in a position to say to you, oh yes, that is going to happen. But first of all, I am not an executive of the company. I'm a non-executive director to approve or disapprove policies that's brought forward by the executive, with my vote if it's required, or my consensus. And that role I will continue to play. But in the public interest, I personally, Ray MacSharry, would love to see everybody that's in arrears tonight find a windfall before Christmas and the arrears are wiped out. But that's not the real world. So we have to live in the real world under company law.
Mr MacSharry.